let's have a personal conversation.
Uh,
Who is Bonhoeffer? Like for the people who don't know, for the choir section that didn't go to seminary.
well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German pastor, and he was kind of this unique combination of being both a pastor and a theologian. And he lived in the early 20th century, and he was very much a product of his times. He was what is called neo-Orthodox. So you may have heard of the Orthodox or the Eastern Orthodox. It has nothing to do with that. Okay. So neo-Orthodoxy was a particular movement in the early decades of the 20th century. And it was really kind of a response to modernism that was trying to, in a sense, rescue the Christian faith from modernism and the modernist project of anti supernaturalism. So, modernism wanted to they were kind of ruled more by the sensibility of the day of science
Mhm.
and scientific discovery. And so certain things from a scientific point of view, from a naturalist point of view, didn't really make sense about
Mhm.
the faith, like the virgin birth or
Yeah.
miracles or the supernatural origin of the Bible. And so the neo orthodoxy was basically kind of a rescue program of reacting to modernism and the threats to the faith. And it was an attempt to kind of create sort of a Noah's Ark of how do we rescue the faith from modernism.
I think that's so interesting because I feel like people often want to rescue the faith when there are these heterodox kind of ideas that come into the church, which always makes me ask the question, why don't we just stay with the faith? Like why do we need to create something neo this, neo that, like
Yeah.
close to,
Adjacent to.
yeah, like I'm neo. Like no, why aren't we, why isn't the answer to the heresy the faith once for all given to the saints?
Well, and that's a fair question. And
I'm trying.
and part of it, you have to understand the context in which Bonhoeffer was born into, which is German theology and what was called continental philosophy. And so German theology, kind of goes back to some important breaking points where Schleiermacher and others in the 19th century, in the 1800s, that were really starting to break the faith away from its historic moorings. And there was kind of this idea of progressivism and knowledge keeps progressing. And so there was this effort to try to preserve the faith. It was an effort to try to preserve the faith, but it was within the context and the presuppositions of naturalism. And so, it 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 kind of grows up in the midst of the formalism of German Lutheranism, where the faith had become very, very rigid and externalized and very different than the faith of Martin Luther from,
Yeah.
a few hundred years before that. And so Bonhoeffer is born into this context of early 20th century German and continental philosophy and theology. And he is trained with a very famous theologian named Karl Barth.
Mhm.
And Karl Barth was also part of the neo-Orthodox movement. And so there's some people in the chat here that was like, I always thought, I'm so confused. Kelly says, I always thought he was a Christian. And Laura says, I always did too. And so It's complicated because there's been a tendency, I think, in the second half of the 20th century to almost remake Bonhoeffer into an evangelical. And here's what you have to know about it. And there's some scenes in the film to this effect of after he does his PhD in theology in Germany, he comes to America to do a postdoc at Union Seminary. Now, Union Seminary is in New York City.
Yeah.
And at that time, liberalism looks a little different in America than it did in Germany. And when Bonhoeffer gets here, he encounters Harlem and the Black culture and discovers the Black church, Negro spirituals, and Black music and all of that. And for him, his experiences in the Black church, and I could be wrong about this, I think he was only here maybe 6 months, but it was a pretty short amount of time. But during that time, his exposure to the Black church kind of taught him a more personal component of the faith. And that was totally foreign to him, coming from the context of this very dry formalism.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to describe it.
No, that would make sense because within the Black church tradition, it is very personal.
Yeah.
And this kind of leads me into something you said leads me into my next question, because between, Kelly and Laura's comments of, I thought he was a Christian, I had no reason to believe that he wouldn't be an evangelical from, what I remember learning about him at Biola.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been, I didn't know he was a spy. I didn't know he did this. I didn't know he did that. Like, I had no idea that he had this controversial past. Yeah. But he does have this controversial past. And so I was going to ask if you would help us understand some of that controversial past.
So in the film, well, let's just talk about real life first, and then if you want to talk about the film, we can.
I was meaning real life.
Yeah, we'll just do real life first because they are two very different things. So the reason he's controversial is largely because of, well, it depends on which part of his life we're talking about. For evangelicals, they might find him controversial because of his neo-Orthodox theology. He didn't hold to a lot of supernatural things and miracles or the supernatural origin or the words of the Bible being inerrant. He kind of had this idea of orthodoxy that the Bible contains God's words, but it is not truly the word of God, the way that we think of it. So you might look for kind of allegorical mentions or core ideas, core doctrines, but those are uncoupled from the miracles and the supernatural nature of the faith. Those things are de-emphasized or put aside altogether. And so that would, I think, for evangelicals be very confusing and controversial. Another major component of his theology, though, was his theology of resistance and pacifism. And this is not like some little tangential aspect of his thought. It was a very important component of his thought. And so some Christians would probably struggle with the idea of pacifism in it, because it's not something that most evangelicals, unless you're over in like the Anabaptist Mennonite crowd, you're not really dealing with pacifism too much. And so that might be a foreign concept for some people.
The laying on of hands is real over in these circles. Amen.
Yeah. So I think that, those are some of the things that some people would find difficult to understand.
But so help me reconcile pacifist Bonnie with assassin Bonnie. Because is that true? Let me ask that question. Is it even true?
So okay, now let's switch to talking about the film.
Because my next question is about the film, so
Yeah,
that might be right in line.
because the film wants to paint him, the subtitle is like pastor, spy, assassin or something.
Yes.
And that's just totally like, that's the part of it I said it was just such a mess. Like, the chronology is way off. He was not, I think calling him an assassin is a way overstatement. It's even it is a debated point to what degree he was involved with the attempt to assassinate Hitler. Like, was he sympathetic to it? Was he friends with people who were adjacent to it? But to call him an assassin is almost like, with all due respect to the filmmakers, I felt like that's just selling tickets. And it's a lie. It's not real. And he was imprisoned, from my understanding. I'm not a Bonhoeffer expert. I know some things about him. I took a class on 20th century theology as part of my education at Talbot, and we did devote some learning to his POV. But I'm not here to say, like, I don't have a PhD in Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But my understanding was that he was arrested for helping Jews. And that was a very small and confusing scene in the film. And with again, with due respect to the filmmaker, and I always like want to have such grace with independent filmmakers because I believe in independent filmmaking, but that scene was a mess. It wasn't well written. I didn't know what was happening. I don't know if they ever did any test audiences to get feedback. It just didn't make any sense. And so it's hard for me to be too sympathetic with how the film portrayed it, because the timeline was all mixed up. They kind of made it seem like he was trying to negotiate for a bomb with the British. I think that's pure fiction. There's a page on the Angel Studios website of like fact and fiction, and I called most of the fiction. Like, there was a scene where all of a sudden he sits down and starts playing jazz, and he's never played jazz before on the piano. And I'm like, oh, this never happened. And I felt myself thinking those thoughts through about 80% of the movie of this never happened. This is made up. This is fiction. And so basically what they did in the film is they took a few key events that happened. Like, there was a German pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He did teach at an underground seminary. He did go to prison for his resistance to the Nazis. He did come to America and study at Union Seminary. He did go attend a Black church. He did kind of have a personal conversion as a result of that. But pretty much everything else in the film was just storytelling. It wasn't really
so
that great. So
how should we think about Bonhoeffer then? Because I think that in my thread or like my Facebook feed, I see a lot of questions about Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
And I think people might be a little bit just confused as to how do we consider,
So Caroline's on the stream. She says Bonhoeffer was imprisoned by the Nazis a year before the assassin attempt. Yeah, that's my understanding too. It would be a stretch to say he was an assassin. I think it's even a controversial point, like how involved he even was with the assassination issue. And Bonhoeffer's family is really not happy about the film. And in fact, I've heard now that and I don't know if this is true, maybe Natalie can Google this for me real quick, but I've heard that Bonhoeffer's family is suing Eric Metaxas, who wrote a biography on Bonhoeffer like 15 years ago, because they're just sick of it. They're tired of Bonhoeffer being used as kind of this prop for conservative talking points. And here's what's interesting about Bonhoeffer is that he's loved by progressives and he's loved by conservatives. And I'm talking about biblical conservatives. I'm not talking about political, but although he is used, I think, by political conservatives as well. But it's almost like everybody has a claim to him and wants to remake him in their image. So I would recommend an article by Richard Weikert, who it's from the Christian Research Journal. I posted a video or an audio podcast version from YouTube of an article that he wrote some years ago in the Christian Research Journal about Bonhoeffer, his life, and his theology. It's a very helpful little article. If you want to find it, you can go on my Facebook page at Theology Mom. Just scroll back a few days and you'll see it linked there. But it's a helpful summary of his theology. How should we think about him? Think about him accurately. Think about him carefully. Understand that he was not an evangelical. He was not a fundamentalist. He didn't believe in inerrancy. Whether or not he even believed in personal conversion is a point of dispute. And he was a product of his times in many respects. And he did participate to some degree in a resistance movement against Hitler. But, we have to be careful about how we think of him and not make him into something that he really wasn't. So,
that's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Amy Davis says Bonhoeffer was a historical hero for his stance against Hitler's ideology, corrupting his homeland. Learning more about his theology has been an eye-opener and explains a lot about stances I see progressive pastors take. Yeah, and you will see Christian progressives love Bonhoeffer too, and they will use him as a prop for their views. Anabaptists will use him as a prop for their theology on pacifism. And I thought the movie did a terrible job representing his views on pacifism. It really wasn't even a point of contact in the film. There were a few lines about it where his student gets a little bent out of shape. Oh, but you're a pacifist. You can't do this. And then it's like 2 sentences, and then they just sort of move on from the topic. It was real strange. So, okay, let me just make a really side comment, and then we can go on to another topic about the film itself. It is a great example of how good acting and quality production value cannot rescue a bad story or a bad script. To me, a script in a film is like the foundation in a house. If it's crooked, if it's not good, the walls are going to be crooked. It's not going to be sound.
Yeah.
The acting and the production value of the film was probably the best I had seen for a Christian film.
Oh, wow.
Really good. The writing was not good. And the guy who directed and produced it and wrote the screenplay, this was like his lifelong dream, I think, to do this film. So I feel bad. Like, it's kind of like criticizing somebody's newborn baby and saying it's kind of ugly. You're like, but it's like, look, yeah, that's kind of how it feels. So I feel really sad, like, saying this stuff, but the script just had so many holes, the plot holes. It wasn't well written. It wasn't well executed. The direction was great. Production value was great. The acting was great. All of that was great, but it could not compensate for the script. And if you don't have a good script, all the good acting in the world will not fix that.